Mythic Rares are pretty cool. It's the highest rarity in Magic the Gathering, and the cards that receive it tend to have super powerful, super unique effects. Many of the best cards in Magic are printed at this rarity. Last month, I took a look at the best white Mythic Rares, and it was pretty interesting, so I thought it would be a good idea to take a look at the other colors too, and this time around we're looking at blue, and boy, is it a stacked list. The white Mythic Rare list was pretty impressive, but this one is even more so. To be eligible for this list, a card had to be mono blue and had to have been originally printed at Mythic Rare. In all, there were 164 cards eligible, and in this video we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic the Gathering.
This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store.
Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I rank cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points, this includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like regional championships. At number 10, it's Jace, Architect of Thought. Planeswalkers have almost always appeared at the Mythic rarity, so it won't come as much of a surprise that there are a few of them on this list. He costs 2 generic and 2 blue for a 4 loyalty Planeswalker. He's got a +1 that makes it so your opponent's creatures get -1/-0 whenever they attack until your next turn, a -2 that reveals your top 3 and an opponent separates those into 2 piles. One pile goes into your hand and the other pile goes on the bottom of your library, and he's got a -8 that lets you search each player's library for a non-land card and exile it, and then you can cast those cards without paying their mana costs. That +1 is pretty good at protecting him, the -2 is good at netting you cards, and if you get the ultimate you're usually going to win by casting 2 super powerful spells for free. As you can imagine, this Jace is well suited to control decks, which is exclusively where it saw play in Standard and Modern. More recently, it's seen a bit of play in Pioneer, where it picked up a top 8 in a blue-white control deck. However, this Mythic Rare is largely inactive these days, without a single top 8 in any format since 2023, and there are some Mythic Rares that are likely to take its spot on this list in the near future, like the card that was at number 11, Urza Lord High Artificer, who has 84 points and is actively seeing play in multiple formats. At number 9, it's Lier, Disciple of the Drowned. He's a 3/4 legendary creature that costs 3 generic and 2 blue, and it makes it so spells can't be countered. He gives all instants and sorceries in your graveyard flashback costs equal to their mana cost. This means you can pay those costs and exile them to cast them. Blue often gets cards that care about instants and sorceries, and Lier isn't the only mythic on the list that is super into them. Basically, since he gives flashback to all of your instants and sorceries, when he enters, he effectively adds a bunch of cards from your graveyard to your hand, and that's a control player's dream. While in Standard, Lier was a key card in control decks. He's also been very important for Pioneer Lotus Field. Here I think it's important to note that Lier's first line of text, spells can't be countered, was intended to be more downside than upside, because if Lier let control decks rebuy all their counter magic, that would be incredibly insane, right? And in Standard, that is largely how it worked, but in Pioneer, that line of text turned into upside. Let me explain. Lotus Field decks are combo decks that use untap effects like Hidden Strings to untap the field and make lots of mana. And Lier lets you get double duty out of all those spells. The deck can go off in a single turn and make enough mana to win the game, and having Lier around means there's pretty much nothing your opponent can do about it, while Lier also makes it way easier for you to keep finding ways to spend mana and ways to untap the field. Lier is going to keep putting up top 8s in Lotus Field decks and Pioneer going forward, but all the cards in front of it are also highly active, so it's hard to imagine it ever doing better than number 9. At number 8, it's Omniscience. For 7 generic and 3 blue, this enchantment lets you cast spells from your hand without paying their mana costs. Yeah, that's an insane ability, and that's why this thing costs a whopping 10 mana. In short, if you combine Omniscience with some draw spells, you can just draw your entire deck and play everything with no problem. The 10 mana hurdle was too big for formats like Block and Standard though. However, there are decks in non-rotating formats that can get Omniscience into play fairly easily. This was first accomplished in Legacy Show and Tell decks, which can put it into play in the extreme early game, and these decks also happen to run lots of other crazy strong permanents to cheat into play, so putting Omniscience into play is often followed by something like Emrakul or Archon of Cruelty, at which point the game is over. The creation of the Pioneer format in 2019 was good news for Omniscience too, as it immediately became part of those aforementioned Lotus Field decks. You can use all that mana you produce to cast Omniscience and draw your whole library, before eventually winning with something like Thassa's Oracle. It's worth noting that Omniscience is also legal in Standard right now, thanks to being printed in Foundations, though as I've mentioned, it's never been a card that did much there, because it's harder to pull off combos with it in formats with smaller card pools, but it's not impossible that some sort of Omniscience combo emerges in Standard in the future, especially with Omniscience legal in the format for so long. Whether or not it sees play in Standard though, this powerful Mythic Rare is going to continue to see play in both Pioneer and Legacy. At number 7, it's Subtlety. For 2 generic and 2 blue, it's a 3/3 with flash and flying, and when it enters, you choose up to 1 target creature or planeswalker spell, and your opponent puts it on the top or bottom of their library. It also has Evoke, which is an alternate casting cost. If you cast Subtlety for that cost though, it immediately gets sacrificed. In this case, you're largely paying for the enters trigger, and the Evoke cost here is exiling a blue card from your hand. In other words, you don't pay any mana. Blue often gets cards that help it interact at the mythic rarity, even getting the ability to target spells that are on the stack sometimes, as with Subtlety. This type of effect even gets around spells that can't be countered, and Subtlety can do it all, even when you're tapped out thanks to Evoke. That kind of free interaction is huge, as it allows you to do what you need to with your mana, but you're never entirely defenseless if you've got Subtlety around, and when you do choose to cast Subtlety for its usual casting cost, you get a pretty nice 2-for-1 and a 3/3 flyer that can be a legit threat on many board states. Subtlety is for Modern Horizons 2, so the only 60 card formats it's legal in are Modern, Legacy, and Vintage. While it's seen play in all 3, it has full-on staple status in Modern, where you should expect most players who are playing blue to be packing at least a couple of these somewhere in their 75. It's going to continue to see heavy play in that format going forward. At number 6, it's Jace Vryn's Prodigy. I promised you some more Planeswalkers, and here's another one, and it's another Jace. Although this one doesn't start out as a Planeswalker, he starts out as a creature. For 1 generic and a blue, he's a 0/2, and you can tap him to draw a card and then discard a card. Then if there are 5 or more cards in your graveyard, you transform him into the Planeswalker Jace, Telepath Unbound, who starts with 5 loyalty, has a +1 that gives a creature -2/-0 until your next turn, a -3 that lets you cast an instant or sorcery from your graveyard, and a -9 that gives you an emblem that mills 5 cards every time you cast a spell. That +1 protects him, while the -3 can often rebuy something like a powerful removal spell or sweeper. The ultimate is admittedly a little bit underwhelming, but can certainly mill the opponent out. So yeah, it takes a little bit of work for sure, but you ultimately end up with a 2-mana Planeswalker, and it's a formidable one too. Flip Jace has been particularly well suited to decks that can quickly load the graveyard, and or that are interested in doing stuff with spells. He's seen significant play in every single format he's ever been legal in, as there are decks in just about every format that can easily transform Jace, and when the baseline is a creature who can loot for free, that's something that many blue decks are very happy to play. At number 5, it's Murktide Regent. For 5 generic and 2 blue, it's a 3/3 with Delve, which means you can exile cards from your graveyard when casting it to pay for 1 generic and its casting costs for each card you exile. It also has flying and enters with a +1/+1 counter for each instant and sorcery card exiled with it, and whenever an instant or sorcery card leaves your graveyard, you put a +1/+1 counter on the Regent. In other words, you can cast this for as little as 2 blue mana by exiling cards in your graveyard, and if all 5 of those cards are instants and sorceries, you just got yourself a 2-mana 8/8 with flying that has the potential to grow even more. That might sound like a pipe dream, but it really isn't. That's what decks that play the Regent are often capable of doing, and that occurring on turn 2 isn't even out of the question, and certainly playing the Regent on an early turn as like a 4/4 flyer that grows later is eminently doable. Like Subtlety, the Regent is for Modern Horizons 2, and that means the only 60 card formats it's legal in are Modern, Legacy, and Vintage. It's heavily played in both Modern and Legacy, as there are plenty of blue spell decks in both formats who can rapidly load the graveyard for the Regent's Delve. The Regent arguably got even better starting in 2024, with the printing of both Psychic Frog and Abhorrent Oculus, 2 other powerful creatures that love cards in the graveyard and can grow the Regent once it's already in play. The Regent is going to continue to be one of the premier creatures in both Modern and Legacy. At number 4, it's Seagate Restoration. This sorcery costs 4 generic and 3 blue and draws cards equal to the number of cards in your hand plus 1, and it also turns off your max hand size for the rest of the game. It's also a modal double-faced card, which means it has another side that you can choose to play it as. In this case, you've got Seagate Reborn, a land that can tap for blue mana, and it enters tapped unless you pay 3 life. While neither side of this card is individually that impressive, I mean, one side is an overcosted draw spell and the other side is a bad island, the fact that this card is modal is a massive deal. It means that if you draw this early, you've got a land you probably need, and if you draw it late when you don't want any more lands, you can cast it for a pretty reasonable effect. That kind of flexibility is so good that the Seagate sees play in every Magic format it's legal in. It's especially good in decks that can abuse the fact that it is a modal double-face card. For example, landless Belcher decks in Modern run lots of modal double-face cards like the Seagate, and don't run any cards that are always lands. That way, when they activate their Goblin Charbelcher, which reveals cards from the top of your library until you hit a land, and then does damage to any target equal to the number of lands you reveal, it always does lethal, since the Belcher doesn't see modal double-face cards like Restoration as lands, but as spells. The fact that it's a blue card in your hand when you need it to be is also very important in Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, because that means it's a land that you can pitch to cards like the aforementioned Subtlety, as well as Force of Will and Force of Negation, which are incredibly important in their formats. Seagate Restoration is going to continue to put up lots of top 8s in multiple formats. At number 3, it's Mindbreak Trap. For 2 generic and 2 blue, it's an instant that exiles any number of target spells. It also has the Trap subtype, which means that if your opponent fulfills some requirement, you can cast it for a discount. In this case, you can cast it for free if your opponent has cast 3 or more spells in a turn. While the Trap is great anytime there's a bunch of spells on the stack, Mindbreak Trap is an especially effective way to hate on one of the game's most busted mechanics, Storm. It's very difficult to keep a Storm player from going off. That's why it's such a dominant deck in the Eternal formats, but Mindbreak Trap is one of the ways you can do it, even when you're tapped out. Sure, it takes your opponent casting 3 spells in a turn, but if your opponent is trying to kill you with Tendrils of Agony, well, they're going to have to cast a ton of spells. Because of how Storm works, simply countering the copy of Tendrils your opponent casts doesn't stop the Storm copies from getting put on the stack. But with Mindbreak Trap, you let all those copies go on the stack, and then you can stop all of them, because it just exiles any and all spells from the stack. Obviously, this is devastating for a Storm player who have a hard time winning if Mindbreak Trap resolves. As a result, the Trap sees lots of play in Magic's most powerful formats, Legacy and Vintage, where Storm is at its strongest. Part of what makes it so appealing is that you don't even have to be a blue deck to make use of it, since in the right matchup, you'll always cast it for free anyway. This makes it one of the most heavily played and important sideboard cards in both formats, and it's going to keep racking up points in both Legacy and Vintage. At number 2, it's Brazen Borrower. For 1 generic and 2 blue, it's a 3/1 with flash and flying that can only block creatures with flying. That's not that impressive, but this comes with an adventure. That means it's a split card that you can also choose to cast as a non-creature spell, in this case as an instant called Petty Theft. For 1 generic and a blue, it lets you bounce a non-land permanent to its owner's hand. If you go that adventure route, you exile the card, and then you can cast it later as a creature. So ideally, you want to cast it as an adventure first, and then as a creature to get full value here. And in the end, you get a nice, flexible, interactive spell that turns into an evasive threat, and it's all from 1 card, which is pretty sweet. You might be thinking that that sounds kind of underwhelming, but it really isn't. Since being printed, Brazen Borrower has gone on to put up top 8s in every format it's ever been legal in, and while it was certainly dominant in Standard, it's not like its score is a result of only doing insanely well in one format. Modern, Pioneer, and Legacy are all formats where the Borrower has seen and continues to see tons of play because it simply offers excellent value. Many of these decks are interested in spells too, and the fact you've got a creature that can be an instant is pretty great. Brazen Borrower is going to continue to rack up points, but the card in front of it is also highly active and has a pretty big lead, so it might not be able to get any higher on the list. That number 1 blue mythic rare is, of course, Jace, the Mind Sculptor. While we're used to getting insane planeswalkers today, Jace the Mind Sculptor was the first time where one felt truly broken, and for a long time it was considered the most powerful planeswalker ever printed. These days it's been surpassed by Oko, and maybe a few others, but it's definitely still in the conversation. He costs 2 generic and 2 blue and starts with 3 loyalty. One of the great things about him is that he sports 4 loyalty abilities, not something a lot of planeswalkers get, especially at 4 mana. His +2 lets you look at the top card of target player's library, and you can choose to put that card on the bottom of that player's library. This ability is surprisingly powerful, as it can allow you to lock your opponent out of ever drawing something useful while ticking up his loyalty. His 0 ability is effectively Brainstorm. In other words, you draw 3 cards and then put 2 cards from your hand back on top of your library. Brainstorm is one of the most powerful card draw spells in Magic, and Jace can just fire it off without lowering his loyalty. He's got a -1 that bounces a creature, which can come in handy when you're a little bit behind, and he's got a -12 that exiles an entire player's library, and then they shuffle their hand into their library. So it completely disarms them and puts them in top deck mode with very few cards left in their deck. So yeah, you can see why Jace the Mind Sculptor was completely insane, and this was especially true in Standard, where it was a staple that helped make Caw-Blade decks one of the most dominant Standard decks of all time, and it got banned after only being in Standard for a single year as a result. When the Modern format was created, Jace was preemptively banned there too, although in 2018 he was finally unbanned in the format. These days he actively sees play in Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, and that's not going to stop anytime soon. Jace the Mind Sculptor has a very long history at this point, and it's also stood the test of time, allowing it to rack up an enormous score, and it's probably going to be number 1 on this list for the foreseeable future. So, those are the top 10 Mythic Rare blue cards in Magic. If you want to get your hands on any of these super strong blue cards, check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. Thanks for watching.